There is a mistake almost everyone makes the moment their life begins to change. The strange part? It doesn't look like a mistake. It looks like honesty. You finally discover a new purpose. You start healing from old wound. You notice yourself becoming stronger, clearer, more certain about who you are. And your first instinct is to tell someone, a friend, a partner, your family. Sometimes thousands of strangers online. It feels natural. It even feels healthy. But what if that single decision, that one moment of openness, quietly destroys the very transformation you've been waiting for? What if every time you announce the person you're becoming, you unknowingly give away the psychological energy needed to actually become that person? Two men, centuries apart, arrived at a surprisingly similar answer to this question. Niccolò Machiavelli spent his life studying how power disappears the moment people can predict you. Carl Jung spent decades watching people lose themselves, not because they lacked intelligence, not because they lacked discipline, but because they exposed parts of themselves that were never ready to be seen. Most people think silence is the absence of confidence. The wisest people know it's often the protection of something still growing. Today, we're going to explore 3 things psychologically mature people almost never reveal too early. Not because they're hiding, but because they understand something most people only discover through painful experience. Some parts of your life lose power the moment they're exposed before they're ready. 1. Never reveal the person you're becoming before you've become them. Every meaningful transformation begins somewhere nobody else can see. Long before your habits change, long before your circumstances shift, long before anyone around you notices something different, a quiet movement begins inside you. You stop wanting what once consumed you. Old ambitions start feeling hollow. New possibilities appear in directions you never thought to look. Most people mistake this feeling for motivation. Jung saw something deeper. He believed these moments often marked the beginning of what he called individuation, the psychological process of becoming more fully yourself, instead of unconsciously living through roles borrowed from your family, your culture, or your fear. But here's the critical problem most people never consider. At this early stage, your new identity is incredibly fragile, not because you're weak, because it's new. Think about a seed. The day after it's placed into soil, you don't dig it back up every morning to check whether it's growing. The constant exposure would destroy the very process you're trying to observe. Growth requires protection before it requires visibility. Your psyche follows the same law. When a new direction first appears inside you, it exists mostly as possibility. It hasn't yet become character. It hasn't survived failure. It hasn't proven itself through consistent action over time. Yet this is exactly the moment most people begin talking. They announce the business before serving the first customer. They describe the new version of themselves before actually living it. They explain their future to people who only know their past. And something subtle begins to happen. The excitement that once pushed them toward action slowly transforms into satisfaction from simply talking about action. This isn't a theory. Psychologists have documented this phenomenon. Publicly announcing certain goals can reduce the internal drive to pursue them, because your brain begins treating social recognition as partial progress. The applause arrives before the achievement, and once your mind receives that emotional reward, the urgency quietly fades. Jung noticed another layer beneath this. The emerging self develops through direct experience, not through public explanation. The more you depend on other people's reactions while your identity is still forming, the more their expectations begin shaping who you become. Without realizing it, you stop asking, "What feels true to me?" and you begin asking, "What will they think?" That single shift changes everything. Because the moment your future depends on external approval, it no longer fully belongs to you. This is where Machiavelli's insight becomes relevant in a way most people don't expect. He understood that revealing your intentions too early gives other people time to respond before you've built enough momentum to withstand their reaction. Some will discourage you, not out of cruelty, but because a person who abandoned their own dreams often struggles to believe in yours. Someone trapped in fear naturally projects caution onto courage, not intentionally. But human beings instinctively measure what's possible through the lens of their own experience. And if you're not careful, their ceiling becomes your ceiling. That's why the strongest transformations are usually the quietest ones. Not because confident people have nothing to say, but because they understand something that takes most people years to learn. Roots always grow before branches. Real transformation is almost always completed before it's announced. And the people who understand this don't look impressive during the process. They look ordinary, even quiet. Then one day, people look at them and say, "You changed overnight." They didn't. You simply weren't invited to witness the months, sometimes years, of silent construction. Here's the question worth sitting with before you move to the next section. Is there something you're currently building that you've already told too many people about? If the answer is yes, that's not a reason for shame. It's information. The work can still be protected going forward, but starting now, guard the vision, not out of fear, out of respect for how fragile new beginnings actually are. 2. Never give everyone access to your deepest wounds. There is a meaningful difference between healing and repeatedly reopening a wound in front of an audience. Modern culture has collapsed this distinction. The message everywhere is simple. Talk about it. Share your pain. Post your story. The more you open up, the healthier you become. But human psychology is more complex than that. Jung spent years listening to people's suffering, and one pattern became impossible to ignore. Some people became genuinely stronger after speaking. Others became weaker. The difference wasn't the wound, it was the container. Who were they speaking to? Was that person capable of truly receiving what was being shared? Could they hold emotional complexity without judgment, without immediately trying to fix it, without making it about themselves? Because not everyone who listens is actually able to receive. Think about handing someone a fragile, irreplaceable object. If they don't understand how delicate it is, they don't have to be cruel to damage it. Carelessness is enough. Your emotional life works exactly the same way. The deepest wounds inside you aren't ordinary information. They're living psychological material. When they're exposed to someone who lacks the maturity or emotional capacity to hold them properly, the wound often leaves the conversation heavier than when it entered. You've probably felt this yourself. You finally gather the courage to tell someone what you've been carrying. For a brief moment, you feel relief. Then comes the response. "You'll get over it. Everyone goes through something. Just stay positive." Or they immediately redirect to their own story, and suddenly your pain disappears beneath theirs. You leave the conversation feeling more alone than before you spoke. Jung recognized something profound here. A wound doesn't heal simply because it's spoken. It heals when it's genuinely understood. Without real understanding, disclosure becomes nothing more than re-experiencing the injury. Your nervous system revisits the pain, but receives none of the safety required to actually transform it. Instead of integration, you get repetition. There's another cost that almost nobody talks about. Information permanently changes relationships. The moment someone knows your deepest fears, your most significant betrayals, your most painful memories, they can never unknow them. Most people won't intentionally use that knowledge against you, but human beings naturally organize their perception of others through memory. Every future interaction gets filtered through what they now know about you. Sometimes they become overprotective. Sometimes they begin to unconsciously define you by your hardest chapter, rather than the person standing in front of them today. That's a quiet cost, but it compounds over time. Machiavelli understood this from a completely different angle. He recognized that detailed knowledge of someone's emotional vulnerabilities creates influence, whether that influence is used deliberately or not. The more precisely someone understands your weak points, the easier it becomes to affect your decisions, your confidence, your sense of stability. This doesn't mean you should become closed or suspicious of everyone. It means discernment is a form of wisdom, not a form of fear. Real intimacy isn't built by how quickly you reveal yourself. It's built by how carefully two people prove, over time, that they can protect what has been revealed. That's a very different standard than what modern culture teaches. The strongest relationships you've ever witnessed weren't built through emotional dumping in the first weeks. They were built through consistency, reliability, through small moments of trustworthiness repeated across months and years. Trust wasn't created by disclosure. Disclosure followed trust. That sequence matters more than most people realize. Reverse it, and intimacy often becomes exposure instead. One more thing Jung observed that almost nobody mentions. People who genuinely healed rarely made their wounds their entire identity. They didn't constantly return to the same stories. They didn't define themselves permanently by what happened years ago. Real healing doesn't erase the scar. It changes your relationship to it. Eventually, the wound stops being the loudest voice in your identity. It becomes one chapter among many, significant, but no longer defining. That's why Jung emphasized discernment over endless disclosure. Speak when speaking serves genuine growth. Stay quiet when speaking only repeats the pain. Not every listener deserves access to your inner world. Some people in your life are companions. Some are acquaintances. Only a very small number, if you're fortunate, become true guardians of your truth. Learning the difference between them is one of the most important skills you will ever develop. Because once you stop looking for everyone to understand you, something unexpected happens. You become free to understand yourself. 3. Never turn your inner work into a performance. There is a moment in almost every person's growth where real progress creates a new and unexpected temptation. Not money, not status, recognition. You finally begin understanding yourself in ways you never could before. You notice patterns that used to control you. You become less reactive, more deliberate. You start recognizing your fears instead of blindly obeying them. And almost immediately, a new impulse appears. The urge to tell everyone how much you've changed. At first, it seems harmless, maybe even generous, like you're sharing something valuable with people who might need it. But Jung warned that this is precisely where the ego often returns. Not wearing its old mask of arrogance or superiority, wearing a new one. The mask of self-awareness. And this mask is far more dangerous than the original. because it's much harder to see through. Instead of becoming someone who is genuinely changing, you begin becoming someone who talks about changing. There's a difference between those two things, and that difference determines whether your transformation actually continues or quietly stops the moment it receives applause. Think about a blacksmith forging a sword. The metal doesn't become stronger because people admire it while it's still inside the fire. It becomes stronger because it stays in the fire long enough, under enough pressure, enough heat, to change at the level of its structure. Take it out too early to show everyone how beautiful it's becoming, and you haven't made a sword. You've made something that looks like one. Human character follows the same principle exactly. Inner work needs time before it needs recognition. Jung called the real process individuation. Not collecting psychological vocabulary, not memorizing philosophical frameworks, not learning the right terminology to describe your trauma, but gradually, sometimes painfully, bringing the unconscious parts of yourself into conscious awareness, confronting the shadow, integrating the parts you've spent years avoiding. That process cannot be rushed, and it absolutely cannot be completed through conversation alone. Here's where most people get quietly derailed. They mistake insight for transformation. They read one powerful book, watch a few lectures, recognize a pattern from their childhood, and then immediately begin explaining psychology to everyone around them. But insight is only the beginning of the process, not the end of it. Real transformation starts after the insight, when nobody is watching, when the initial excitement has faded, when the difficult, unglamorous work actually begins. The real questions are never about what you understand. They're about what you can do under pressure. Can you respond differently during conflict instead of defaulting to old patterns? Can you remain calm when someone criticizes you? Can you maintain your values when compromising them would be easier? Can you practice discipline on the days when nobody is watching and nobody will reward you for it? Those moments reveal whether wisdom has actually entered your character, or whether it's still just living inside your vocabulary. This is where Machiavelli's perspective intersects with Jung's in a way that most people find uncomfortable. Machiavelli never judged people by what they claimed about themselves. He judged them by their consistent behavior across time. Because anyone can describe discipline, very few actually demonstrate it when it costs them something. Anyone can announce emotional maturity. Very few possess it when they're under real pressure and their ego is genuinely threatened. Anyone can speak about patience, integrity, self-control. The words are easy. The behavior, sustained, consistent, unprompted, is extraordinarily rare. Real influence has always preferred evidence over explanation, and real psychological maturity works the same way. Think about the most emotionally grounded person you've ever personally known. Not a figure you admire from a distance, someone you actually encountered in real life. They probably never introduced themselves by saying, "I'm a highly self-aware person," or "I've done a lot of inner work." You simply felt something different in their presence. They listened more than they spoke. They responded to situations instead of reacting to them. They didn't rush to defend themselves when challenged. They didn't need to dominate every conversation to feel secure in it. Their confidence felt quiet, not because they lacked opinions or conviction, but because their identity no longer depended on winning every exchange. That's what genuine inner work actually produces. Not louder personalities, stronger centers. And here's something counterintuitive that almost nobody tells you.
People often become far more influential the moment they stop trying to appear impressive. Because certainty carries a completely different energy than performance. Performance is constantly asking, sometimes desperately, "Do you see me? Do you understand how far I've come?" Genuine certainty simply says quietly, "I know who I am." That difference changes every relationship you have. People begin trusting you more, not because you've become more persuasive or more articulate about your journey, but because you've become more consistent. Your actions stop competing with your words. They start confirming them. And that consistency creates something that modern culture is genuinely starving for: credibility. There's one more thing nobody tells you about the habit of turning your inner work into public content. And it might be the most important point in this entire video. Every time you explain your growth to someone, you are forced to crystallize it into language. You take something that is alive, evolving, still moving, and you compress it into sentences, into a story, into a version of yourself that other people can understand and react to. And something always gets lost in that translation. The nuance disappears. The complexity flattens. The living experience becomes a narrative you repeat. And the more you repeat it, the more your identity slowly locks itself into the version of yourself you've constructed for public consumption. You stop becoming. You start protecting a narrative.
Most people don't recognize when this happens. They genuinely believe they're inspiring others, being authentic, contributing something valuable. And sometimes they are. But there's a hidden cost running beneath all of it. Every time you announce how much you've changed, you send a quiet signal to your brain that the work is finished, that you've arrived somewhere, that this chapter is complete. And the moment your mind believes that, the momentum stops. Because real growth is never a destination. It's a direction, a permanent, ongoing orientation towards something deeper. The moment you declare victory, forward movement quietly ends. Machiavelli understood something crucial about the image people project of themselves. Once you've positioned yourself publicly as the self-aware one, or the person who healed, or the one who figured it out, every new mistake becomes a contradiction you have to manage. You can no longer simply be human. You have to be consistent with your brand. And that pressure, subtle but relentless, slowly suffocates the part of you that still needs to grow, fail, learn, and change without an audience evaluating every move. Jung documented this pattern across decades of clinical work. People who spoke constantly about their psychological development often made less actual progress than people who worked in silence. Not because speaking is inherently harmful, but because the brain responds to perceived completion. The moment someone validates your insight with approval or admiration, your nervous system relaxes. The emotional reward arrives. The work feels done, even when it's barely begun. Real transformation is almost always invisible to the people watching it from the outside. They see the results. They don't see the foundation that made those results possible. They see the confidence. They don't see the months of self-doubt that preceded it. They see the calmness. They don't see the hundreds of private internal battles that eventually created it. And that gap between what people observe and what actually happened is precisely where wisdom lives. The people throughout history who changed the world most profoundly shared one unexpected characteristic. They were not obsessed with explaining themselves. They allowed time to reveal who they were. Their lives became the argument, not their words. So what do these three principles look like when you hold them together?
Protect the vision of who you're becoming. Not because secrecy gives you power, but because protection allows the transformation to actually finish its work before the world begins reacting to it. Protect the deepest parts of your pain, not because vulnerability is wrong, but because real healing requires the right container, and not every person in your life is capable of being that for you. Protect the quiet work happening inside your own mind, not because inner development is something to hide, but because genuine change doesn't require a broadcast. It requires time, pressure, and the kind of silence that allows something real to form. A seed buried in soil isn't hiding, it's growing. A sculptor doesn't unveil unfinished marble to gather opinions on its progress, not because he's ashamed of the work, but because greatness requires uninterrupted creation. Your inner life deserves exactly the same respect. In a world where everyone feels constant pressure to update, explain, document, and broadcast themselves, silence has become genuinely rare. And because it's rare, it's become powerful. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of avoidance or insecurity, the silence of discipline. The silence of someone who understands that the most important work of their life is happening right now, and that it doesn't need an audience to be real. The next time you feel the urge to announce a new dream, pause for just a moment and ask yourself honestly, am I looking for encouragement or am I looking for validation? The distinction matters more than it might seem. Encouragement pushes you forward. Validation stops you in place by convincing you that you've already arrived. The next time you feel compelled to share your deepest wound with someone, ask a harder question. Has this person demonstrated, through their actual behavior, not just their intentions, that they can protect what I'm about to give them? Don't answer based on how much you like them. Answer based on what you've actually watched them do. And the next time you want the people around you to know how much you've grown, ask yourself one final question. Would my actions tell this story, even if I never spoke another word about it? If the answer is no, the work isn't finished yet. Let it continue, quietly, patiently, without rushing toward an audience that isn't ready to receive it yet, and a version of yourself that isn't ready to be revealed. Because one day, people won't ask what happened to you.
They'll simply notice that something about you feels different, more grounded, more peaceful, harder to destabilize. Not because you learned how to appear strong, but because you finally stopped giving away the parts of yourself that were still becoming. Carl Jung believed that becoming your true self was never a performance. It was a lifelong, deeply private relationship with your own interior. Machiavelli understood that real influence was rarely built through explanation. It was built through discipline, restraint, and the kind of consistent action that speaks long before words ever need to. Perhaps these two men, centuries apart, working in completely different worlds, were pointing toward the same truth. The strongest people are not those who reveal the most. They are the ones who understand exactly what must remain protected until time and silence and honest work have done what no audience ever could. The real work isn't impressive. It's invisible. The real strength isn't loud. It's quiet. The real power isn't in being seen. It's in knowing exactly who you are when nobody is watching. And that knowledge, once it becomes genuine, will make itself visible. Not through your announcements, through your presence,
Not through your explanations, through your consistency. Not through the story you tell about yourself, through the undeniable reality of who you've become. That's the kind of transformation that lasts. That's the kind of growth that compounds over years, not weeks. That's the kind of power that nobody can take from you, because you never gave it away in the first place. If this perspective shifted something in how you see yourself, you already know what to do next. The strongest roots always grow in silence.